It's now my pleasure to introduce some leading experts from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. That's a mouthful. That's an agency that is actually one of the most influential in this area and in fact in the country in regulating air pollution. At the same time, they've taken on the task of presenting their agenda as focused on climate change. And last year they released a very influential climate action strategy for the whole region, one of the most aggressive in setting goals. And in that plan, which I recommend to you, is a whole section about food and the potential for reducing emissions with food. It's my pleasure to introduce Dave Burch and Abby Young from the Air District.
Good morning. I'm Abby, manager at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. This is a very different audience than what Dave and I are used to presenting to. So this is very exciting for us to be here today, and thanks to LinkedIn for hosting us. So I'm going to do the first part of the presentation, quickly tell you what our agency is, and then briefly kind of go through the basics of climate change and climate change impacts, and then I'll hand it over to Dave, and Dave will dig in more into the interconnection between climate change and food. So the Bay Area Air Quality Management District is a regional agency, and historically we have focused on, and our mission has been to achieve and maintain clean and healthy air in the Bay Area. And we support public health by making sure that everybody in the Bay Area has clean air to breathe. But along the way, we realized that if we don't also address climate change, we stand to lose many of the gains that we've made over the years in achieving clean air here in the Bay Area. So climate change has become a part of our mission. So what's the connection? Well, and here are a number of different types of impacts that we're feeling here in the Bay Area, and I think that you're probably familiar with many of these. The average temperature is rising, and that's of particular concern to the Air District because on these very hot days, when temperatures rise, we have a much more accelerated production of smog. And of course, that is something that affects public health. And we have to call more spare the air days. So rising temperatures is of concern to us. And also, we see an increased frequency and intensity of heat waves. We're also seeing a longer heat wave season. They're beginning earlier in the spring and they're lasting later into the fall. Our Bay coastline is rising, and many of us have experienced that firsthand with inundation around the coastal areas during king tides and storm surges. And we've all heard about the dwindling Sierra snowpack. By the end of the century, it's estimated that we're going to lose about 2/3 of our Sierra snowpack, and that's going to have huge impacts to our water supply. And of course, we all know, I live in Marin County and I'm watching the news today because there's a new wildfire in Marin. The frequency and severity and destruction of wildfires is increasing every year. So these are some very serious impacts that climate change is bringing to us here in the Bay Area. So what's causing climate change? Well, carbon dioxide accounts for the lion's share of the human-made or human-produced greenhouse gases. But there are other very important and potent greenhouse gases that also contribute. Methane is about 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in terms of its ability to impact and to fuel global warming. And in the Bay Area, the largest sources of methane are landfills and cattle, or in the Bay Area from dairy farms. So what we eat, our diets, and how we treat waste are very important. Black carbon or soot is also a strong climate change influencer. And then there's a family of gases called fluorinated gases. These are all human-produced synthetic gases. We use them a lot in refrigeration and in air conditioning. And whereas methane's about 80 times more potent in terms of global warming than carbon dioxide, some of these fluorinated gases are thousands of times more potent. And this is the fastest growing class of greenhouse gases in California and the Bay Area. So another very important source. So there are millions of years of stored carbon in our planet, in the vegetation and the geology of the Earth. And basically, we have let the genie out of the bottle and we can't put it back in. That's what's happening with climate change. A lot of these things that are happening in response to global warming have feedback loops, or you can think of them as multiplier effects. They don't just cause one impact, but that impact causes another impact. And so this is where it starts getting very worse. There's also tipping points. For example, there is a temperature threshold at which there will be irreversible melting of the Greenland ice sheet. Now, nobody knows what that temperature threshold is, but everybody agrees that we really hope we haven't hit it yet. So when people talk about the urgency of climate change, this is what they're talking about. Now, this morning, Tracy Desjardins talked about the human element of sustainability, and there's a human element to climate change impacts as well. Up till now, I've been talking about a lot of the physical and environmental impacts that we're seeing, but these have human ramifications. I've talked about how increasing heat will affect air quality, and deteriorating air quality in turn will impact public health. And often, the most vulnerable members of our communities, the very young, the very old, often those with lower incomes, tend to be disproportionately impacted by health impacts due to air quality or poor air quality. And the sad irony is a lot of these populations had very little to do with contributing to climate change. So climate change also has ripple effects across some of these other categories. We see damage to critical infrastructure, which can cause economic losses and losses in insured losses. And then we see government agencies that struggle to respond. So now I'm giving you that warm and fuzzy opening. I think I was supposed to be the uplifting speaker this morning. I'm not sure it's working out that way. But I'm going to hand it over to Dave, and he's going to talk a little bit more about the integration and the interconnectedness between food and climate change. And then I promise you we will have a more uplifting conclusion.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And so, yes, I'd like to drill down a little bit more into the specific relationship between climate change and the food sector. I have to say, we're here as an air quality agency. This is a relatively new subject for us, as Abby mentioned. Frankly, I think most of you in the room may be already out in front of us based on the questions and comments that we heard in response to Tracy Desjardins' talk. Obviously, we've got a very up-to-speed audience here today. But we want to lend our voice because the more we understand about the relationship between food and climate, the more we see that it's something we do need to address. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how climate change will impact food production, but also how food production contributes to climate change. Going to talk just a little bit about some of the solutions. That's going to be a focus of a lot of the rest of the day. We'll be hearing from a lot of speakers. But the bottom line is that, as most of you know, we have ambitious goals to reduce GHG emissions here in California. The state and our agency are committed to reducing emissions 40% by year 2030 and 80% by year 2050. That's a very challenging goals in a relatively short time frame. And the more we understand it, the more we see that we will not be able to achieve those goals if we don't really tackle the food sector. So just a few very basic messages that I hope you'll bear in mind and take away. Food is a major contributor to the climate change problem. Therefore, it can and must play a big role in the solution. And we're going to need to address it from both the supply side, how food is produced, as well as the demand side, what we consume. Food and climate are obviously tightly linked. There's probably no human activity that's more dependent on climate and weather than food production. So the climate change is going to impact our food production capabilities. At the same time that flipping it around, food production is a major contributor to the emissions of greenhouse gases. In terms of how climate change impacts food production, we're going to see impacts on food production here in California for sure, and all at the global level as well. California, of course, is a major contributor, a major producer of vegetables, fruits, nuts. These are all products that are important to our economy, but they're important to the nutritional value here in the state and worldwide. And those products are highly vulnerable to the effects of heat, drought, extreme weather events, including flooding. As temperatures rise, we're going to see more evaporation from soil. Drought can lead to depletion of our aquifers. So bottom line is we're expecting that we'll see crop and forage losses going forward. These are impacts that then are going to impact the supply, the cost, and the quality of the food that all of us depend on, and that those of you in the food service industry, it's obviously critical for you. One of those impacts in terms of the quality relates to nutritional value of food. And this is one that I don't think has gotten as much attention in the mainstream media so far, but there's been studies done to look at what is the impact of raising crops in a high CO2 type of atmosphere. And the findings are pretty disturbing. There's been evidence that food in high CO2 atmosphere will see diminished protein content, as well as loss of key minerals such as iron and zinc, B vitamins. So that's by no means trivial. And it's particularly concerning because we're not talking about like specialty crops here, but these are effects that have been observed in major staple grains, rice, wheat, barley, soybeans, across the board. That's got to be a concern. So let's flip it around now and talk about how food production contributes to climate change. So there we're looking at both indirect impacts as well as direct impacts. When we're talking about the indirect impacts, we're really talking about how does the food cycle influence the food production influence the carbon cycle that's in nature. Forests, wetlands, and soil are major repositories of carbon. When natural lands, such as forests and wetlands, are converted to farmland, that can reduce the carbon storage potential of the soil. And so this is where food production and agricultural practices are really important, because the right practices can help the soil to retain more carbon. That helps to reduce greenhouse gases. It helps the soil to retain water as well. Conversely, practices that contribute to disturbing the soil or eroding the soil can release that carbon into the atmosphere and increase CO2 levels. So this is oftentimes talked about under the rubric of carbon farming, but it's an important subject, and I think it's one that is going to get a lot more attention going forward. In addition to those more or less upstream effects, there's a lot of direct effects from the production of food as well. And that really is at every step of the food production process. So even before the seeds go in the ground or anything, there's emissions related to bringing the inputs to the farm site, the fertilizers, the seeds, et cetera. There's all the emissions that go into the fossil fuels that power the tractors and the trucks and the food processing equipment. emissions related to water delivery to the farms, emissions from the cattle and dairy productions, from food storage, and then ultimately, if there's wasted food, emissions from the landfills. So all along that pathway, there's emission impacts from food production. So this is a pie chart looking at what are the different types of greenhouse gases that we see from the food sector. And the real takeaway here is that we see the full spectrum of greenhouse gases emitted from food production. Yes, there's carbon dioxide from combustion of fossil fuels to power the equipment and the trucks and the food processing machinery. But we also see significant emissions of nitrous oxides from fertilizer application, as well as methane from the production of meat and dairy products. That's basically the burping from cattle and lamb. And finally, those fluorinated gases that are used for refrigerants. So those F gases, the nitrous oxide, the methane, as Abby pointed out, are all highly potent climate-forcing agents. Now, in this pie chart, we're showing what are the emissions related to the various activities in the food production cycle. I think the real takeaway here is that, as you see with the big blue slab that dominates the pie here, its production is where most of the emissions do occur. If you look at the red slice and the green slice, that's collectively the emissions from transportation, and that's on the order of 10 to 12%. So transportation certainly is an important piece of it. We don't want to minimize that, but the bottom line is that we're not going to get where we need to go on the food production side unless we really roll up our sleeves and get into the production techniques. So I want to sort of shift gears here a little bit and talk about things a bit more from the consumption side with food. We wouldn't be standing here if we had knew what we knew just a couple of years ago. But when we were getting ready to do our new clean air plan and our climate strategy, we thought it was important to consider all the different perspectives, the different ways that you can evaluate our climate change impact. Here in the Bay Area, we're a very affluent region. We import a lot of goods and services and food from outside of our region. And so if you look at things from the standpoint of what's the GHG footprint of an average Bay Area household and what is the contribution from food, it's pretty illuminating. This bar chart that you see here is a product of a collaboration that we had with the Cool Climate Network at UC Berkeley. And frankly, this was a real eye-opener for us because we've traditionally looked at emissions from the standpoint of what are the emissions that are actually physically produced within our region. And on that basis, food is only about 1 or 2% of the total emissions. But when we looked at it from the consumption side, we see that food is actually about 10 times larger in terms of its contribution. It's the second largest sector currently to transportation. But as we move forward with our programs in the state to reduce emissions from buildings and electrify the motor vehicle sector, get fossil fuels out of transportation, we're actually looking at a future going down, 20, 30 years down the road where food is likely to be the largest contributor to the GHG footprint of an average household. So clearly, it's only going to become a more important part of the solution as we go forward. There's already been a lot of talk about the role of meat and the composition of our diet. There's a lot of different ways you can look at that. This is a bar chart showing the GHG intensity of food. The two top bars there, the long ones, are beef and lamb. And then you see down at the bottom, that's cereals, fruits, and vegetables, the things that our doctors tell us we should be eating more of. And this is based on the GHG intensity per kilo of food produced. There's a lot of different ways you can measure this, but the bottom line being that there are indeed a lot more emissions embedded in a pound of red meat than there are in fruits and vegetables. So I just want to talk a little bit then about some of the opportunities to reduce emissions from the food sector. There's opportunities both from food production as well as consumption. On the production side, the big one to start with, of course, is reducing food waste. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on that because we have a whole panel about that this afternoon. But the statistics about the amount of food that's wasted are very sobering. And I think it's important to remember that when we talk about food waste, we're not just talking about the food itself that ends up going to the landfill, but there's the waste of all those upstream inputs, the topsoil, the water, the fertilizer, the fossil fuels, everything that went into producing that food ultimately is wasted if that food is not consumed. In addition, there's definitely opportunities for improving our efficiency in the transportation sector of food, but also from things like the way fertilizers are applied, becoming more efficient in that kind of a thing. New technologies, as Tracy pointed out, ultimately going to need to be a big part of the solution as well. There's some promising things going on out there. Obviously, the Impossible Burger is one example, but you probably read about some interesting studies and pilots that have been done. For example, adding certain types of seaweed to cattle food in a small proportion seems to actually result in considerable reduction in the amount of methane from the cattle. Those things need to be proven in the real world and taken to scale, but those are the kind of opportunities that we need to take advantage of. And there's also things that can be added to the soil to increase the ability of the soil to retain carbon, et cetera. So again, that carbon farming will need to be a big part of the solution. And then if we flip it around and we look at it from the food consumption side, because all the analyses that we've looked at say that if we do all the right things on food production, that'll make a big contribution, but it's not going to be sufficient for helping us get to those very ambitious targets that we have for 2030 and 2050. So we're going to have to deal with the food consumption side as well. And ultimately that comes down to primarily to dietary choices. Yes, the amount that we eat matters, but probably even more important, it's what do we choose to eat. And ultimately, we individually and collectively, we need to eat lower on the food chain, less processed food, less red meat and dairy. Of course, we want to reduce waste on the consumption in the household as well. We can eat with the seasons, we can buy locally sourced food, et cetera. All those things will make a contribution. At the end of the day, we're not going to try to dictate, obviously, what anybody wants to eat. We respect that there are individual needs and preferences, but we do think it's really important to help people understand how big of a contribution food makes to our GHG footprint, how much of an opportunity there is for food to contribute to that solution, and to help people understand how they can make modest changes in their own life that will be a significant contributor to solving the problem. I'm just going to turn it back to Abby for a little wrap-up.
So to meet this challenge, we really have to change the way that we're doing things. And the good news is we are. The state of California is an international leader in setting targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We heard about a couple of new ones that were just set yesterday. And the state is on track, actually, for meeting those. So that's encouraging. Also, here in the Bay Area, 70 cities and counties have already adopted and are implementing local climate action plans, more than any other metropolitan region of the country. And that's very encouraging as well. But neither do the state's plans nor any of these local climate action plans address food. So that's where you all come into the picture. This is a tremendous opportunity, and there's a ton of things that you can do, and nobody else is really doing it. This is an action gap that we need you to fill. So the challenge is profound. I think we all realize that, and the food sector is critical. Now, here in the Bay Area, a lot of folks say, well, it doesn't matter what we do because the rest of the world and China and India and all of this. But the biggest impact that we here in the Bay Area can make in terms of climate change and turning this around is the model that we create that can be exported and replicated throughout California, throughout the US, and throughout the world. So that's what we need to do here, and that's your charge. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned during the human ramification of climate change, there were different areas. Among these, I have read environmental justice. So I am the Italian chairman of the Italian Federation for Human Rights Environment and Innovation Committee. So our fight is for the environmental justice because we know that by 2050 there will be 147 million climate migrants, and so far at international level no one is recognizes human rights for climate refugees. We have human rights for political refugees, but not for climate refugees. So I was wondering if you, or maybe someone of this amazing audience, is doing the same battle, the same fight for this specific aspect.
Well, in terms of the air district, we're very focused on the air component of all these elements to climate change. And here in the Bay Area, what we really focus on in terms of environmental justice is how can we ensure that no matter where anyone in the Bay Area lives, or no matter how much money they have, that they have access to clean and healthy air every single day. So that's one of our long-term goals. But the way we achieve that goal is also very important. We want to make sure that everybody is free from these air quality impacts of climate change, but we also want to make sure that everybody has equal access to benefiting from the promise that the solutions bring in terms of job creation, in terms of healthy air, of course, and in terms of quality of life improvements. So, and I think on one of the earlier slides, I didn't speak to it, but there was a bullet point that talked about partnerships. So one thing that the Air District does, we do a lot of regulation. We regulate air pollution from refineries and factories and things like that. But we also do a lot of voluntary work. So we provide grants and incentives. We partner with groups like Acterra to do events like this. And we have a very robust community engagement and outreach program. So part of what we try to do through those voluntary programs is make sure that we're reaching all the communities in the Bay Area and working with partners to develop solutions that are going to benefit everyone. Didn't really speak too much to your point, but from the Air District's perspective, that's kind of how we do things.
David, this question is for you. You had a slide showing the San Francisco household average carbon footprint, I think it was. And I saw that composting was a tiny little sliver and recycling was larger. I'd be curious if you could speak to whether that's primarily about behavior. Is recycling just much more common? Or if that suggests something about the impact, and from that is the message that we should be really doing a lot to try to increase composting behavior, or if we should, really the point is just to focus primarily on upstream solutions and reducing waste.
So what you see here with composting and waste, or excuse me, the composting and recycling, is essentially a credit that goes back to reduce the overall GHG footprint of a typical household. The actual composition of this this piece here, we didn't break it down by individual sector. I suspect that if we were to do that, we would see composting would be significantly more of a contributor for the food sector than for the other pieces of it. Composting is something that we're working on a lot. Obviously, we're just one player among many, but we see it as important to the overall solution. The statewide scoping plan adopted by the Air Resources Board calls for essentially putting all organic matter to productive use by, I believe it's 2030 or 2035. So that could include composting as well as making biofuels and that type of thing. There are issues with composting in terms of air quality, and so that's something we're working on a lot. We're developing an overall methane strategy for the region, and so that's a combination of looking at methane emissions from oil and gas production that occurs within the region and distribution. It's looking at reducing the amount of material that goes to landfills, encouraging composting, et cetera. And I would hope that if we were to do another version of this 5 or 10 years down the road, that composting segment will be larger than it is right now. But there's definitely potential to do more. But we do have to do it in a way that deals with the issues related to odors and making sure that the composting is done the proper way.
One more question.
I have a question about, David, something that perhaps you referenced around this recycling and composting, but there was a UC study that came out recently that is saying something that 29% of climate change is attributed to the disposables, single-use disposables associated with food. And I was wondering if you came across that study and also whether, and connected to that, perhaps if reuse has been factored into your equation there for reversing some of these effects.
I'm not sure that I'm actually familiar with that specific study, and certainly one we can take a look at. The methodology that was used to develop this chart here and the overall consumption-based emissions inventory that we developed, that was done in conjunction with UC Berkeley, their Cool Climate Network. They're the ones that came up with the methodology, and so they sort of have all the details about all the different assumptions and data sources that went into that. But they're doing a lot of interesting work, and they're continuing to refine the methodology and update it with new information going forward. I think it's fair to say there's a vast literature of things related to how food impacts climate and vice versa. And so this is only a sort of a snapshot in time. It's mostly there just to kind of give us an idea of the order of magnitude. There's a lot of details in there that, like any study like this, it's not perfect on every detail, but we do think it's really informative for helping us understand the big picture.